Thank you, Ben. And good afternoon, everybody, our patron minister, life members, and members and guests. I volunteered some time ago to write the history of farm riders, and I thought I was old enough to know you should never volunteer for anything. So I've trawled through many boxes at the Mitchell Library and other boxes of information I've collected from here and there. And as a result, I've got a whole bunch of boxes of paper in one of our spare bedrooms. And I'm under instructions that that's not their final resting place, as you could imagine. But it's been an interesting trawl through the thing, and I commend that Don Jones is one of our original founding committee members here and the original treasurer of the association. So I won't dwell too much on the beginning. Other than as you back of your menus will note that the first meeting of the Agricultural Press Club, as it was then working title, was held at the Pitt Club in Pitt Street, Sydney at 1 p.m. on the 12th of August 1966. They decided to have a committee of a president, two vice presidents, an honorary secretary treasurer, which role was split quite quickly, and a committee of 3. That structure remained in place almost since then. I should add that there's a gap in my information because there doesn't seem to be any written records between 1980 and 1992-3, so if there is information I've missed out, it's because of that, or my lack of diligence or whatever. No, I do have the financial records in 2 brilliantly kept ledger books, all handwritten and ticked off in green pen by the auditors of the day, so I do have that and know that they made money at the time, modest as it was. Since that original committee structure, the committee has expanded from 3 to 8, and the immediate past presidents have been added as an ex officio member of the committee. Early terms were unlimited. It was noted that the entire executive spent 7 years in their same positions in the early 1970s. While the records are incomplete, Trevor Brown and Sandy Grieve were presidents for a period of time, it's not known who which, from the early 1980s to the early 1990s. And in 1996, a policy was introduced where presidents' terms were to be limited to 3 years. Thankfully for those of us who followed. Succession has nearly always been by arrangement, with 2 known exceptions. In 1997, there was a postal ballot for the 3 committee members. In 1996, there was a ballot for the presidency between the incumbent Sandy Grieve and Don Jones. There was a very large attendance at the AGM who voted for Don to become the president. However, there's also a very large number of proxy votes received, mostly by facsimile, for those of you who can remember what they were, or by mail, I can remember that, what that was. And the largest number of them favoured Sandy. 2 legal opinions were sought and received. Thankfully both didn't come to the same conclusion, but it was resolved that the Articles of Association or our Constitution didn't actually provide for voting by proxy. So that's the only other known contest for the presidency. There may have been more that I'm unaware of, over a few drinks at the bar perhaps. Seminars. The original concept of having a lunchtime seminar with a meal and a guest speaker is basically retained ever since. I mean, there's been a few variations. There's been debates, there's been symposium, there's been forums where there's been multiple speakers or whatever you call it, but generally there has been a lunch and a speaker. I know the first lunch cost $1 and was bangers and mash. Today I know you all pay a little bit more, but this compares much more favourably than bangers and mash, I'm sure you'll agree. There have been many venues. The other thing, in 2008 there was the introduction of AgriBuzz, which is a cocktail type function which many of you all will have attended. That's been extremely successful. It's been targeted mainly at the younger members of the association. And in latter years it's been largely sponsored by our key corporate members, and that's been greatly appreciated. The many venues for those lunches over the years, we seem to have moved on nomadically about every 5 years, from the Pitt Club to the Journalists Club, Royal Navy House, Commercial Travellers Club, New South Wales Leagues Club, the Menzies, the Ritz-Carlton, you name it. but special occasions we've come to the Strangers Dining Room at Parliament House, courtesy of our patron. Attendance numbers have been varied over the years. In 1967 they averaged 40. They had 78 to be Ian Sinclair in 1975, 165 for Burrabogie Joyce, 227 at last year's Christmas party, and about 160 today. We average about 80 at an event this year. Guest speakers, over 50 years and about 10 functions a year, there's been about 500 speakers have addressed us as a group of members. The largest demographic have been politicians, as you'd expect, particularly since we've had budget breakfasts and these annual functions here at Christmas parties. But putting those aside, the most regular attendance of politicians, or the most notable might have been Doug Anthony, Sir William McMahon, Sir Garfield Barrick, John Kieran, Ian Sinclair, John Anderson, Bob Collins, Tim Fisher, Ken Reid and Burrabogie Joyce. And a few of them, particularly John Anderson and Doug Anthony and Ian Sinclair, were repeat performers. Most speakers have come from the industry, but we've had a few journalists, union officials, farmers. Am I going too slow? I'm fine, thank you. Academics, you name it, and a few repeat speakers. But from whatever background they've come, they've all given their time, knowledge and opinion for free. And the association owes its very existence to all those speakers, for which we thank them. Membership. In the beginning, membership was restricted to working journalists, and I think it might be on the back of your lunchtime menus, which I'll read out. Journalists, broadcasters, artists or photographers who regularly prepare material for rural audiences, while those working in public relations type roles were called associate members. And if you didn't fit into that, too bad. Initial annual membership fees were $1. They were increased to $2 the following year. It was just after decimal currency. Cost of lunches were $1, as I said. By the end of the first year, there were 58 members. By 1971, they had 82. And from the financial records in 1980-81, I see there were 135 individuals and 35 corporate members. Corporate membership was introduced in 1972. With the dwindling number of agricultural journalists located in Sydney over the last 50 years, the corporate members have been the backbone of this society, particularly for the last 10 years. There were only 11 corporate members in 1972-3, and the then secretary, a chap called Stan Benson, who was the PR manager at CSR, and I'll talk about it again in a minute, he wrote individual letters, or his secretary typed them for him, no computers in those days, to 72 corporations. They were full one-page letters, most of which were the same except the beginning, but they were individually addressed to the CEO or the general manager or him of the day, to oil companies, commodity marketing boards, etc., etc. He got 44 responses, 31 of whom sent money, forwarded their cheques for $50. Reading through all those members today, those corporate members, the only two that stand out as being still in existence even, with the New South Wales Department of Agriculture, thank you. I mean, I don't know that, I assume you've been corporate members ever since. And Elders, they were members then, they still exist. Ampol, Australian Meat Board, Elders, AML&F, Cinnamon, Merck, Sharp and Dome, all gone or changed names or whatever. Brilliant. The available records of life membership says there's been 10 life members. 4 of them, to my knowledge, are still alive. Those 3 here today, and Trevor Brown, who lives up on the Central Coast, who I spoke to yesterday. Financially, Farm Riders has been a not-for-profit organisation through its lifetime. It made a profit in its first year of 80 cents, when Don Jones was the treasurer. Well managed, Don. Since then, it's generally produced many modest annual surpluses, although it's, and including, despite the fact that it sent a number of people to IFAJ conferences and things around the world in many, many years since. Initially, they were usually committee members or senior journalists, and more recently, they've been winners of awards such as Star Prizes. Today, Farm Riders is in a sound financial position with funds in excess or assets in excess of $100,000. Other associations. Founders of Farm Riders are always keen to look beyond their own backyard. and form associations with like-minded people in other parts of Australia, indeed the world. In the 1960s and 70s, they helped formation of other similar groups in Victoria and Queensland. And 1970, they became affiliated with the Federation of Agricultural Journalists, IFAJ, and sent some delegates to their conference in Dublin. In the early 1970s, Stan Benson, then the secretary, he was instrumental in the formation of the Australian Council of Agricultural Journalists, by which in 1970 included representatives from nearly every state of Australia, with then the exception of South Australia. Don't know why. He also was instrumental in the formation of the Asian Agricultural Journalists and Writers Association in 1972 and became its inaugural Secretary General. In 1988 and 2000, the IFAJ Congress was held in Australia with farm writers personnel, particularly Sandy Grieve and Colin Munro, taking a leading role in their organisation. There have been many people who've worked in roles in farm writers over the last 50 years, from far-sighted journalists to dedicated treasurers, hard-working secretaries, or just committee members spending hours and hours, countless hours of doing their voluntary work, from which we appreciate. There have been 13 presidents in that time. Initially, of course, you had to be a working journalist to be an office bearer. Thankfully that changed, and I was the first non-journalist PR person to be elected to that role. Now, there's a few people we should mention and who had a key role in this organisation during the time, and I'll be as brief as I can, Ben. But Stan Benson was one of the initial movers and shakers. He was a PR man at CSR. He was a voracious correspondent. The records at the Mitchell Library include copies of all those letters that he wrote. In those days, all the correspondence was typed, and so all the outward correspondence is carbon copies. The inward correspondence is typed and signed in fountain pen. This is even the correspondence between various members of the committee. No texts or SMSs in those days. He was the instigator of IFAJ. He worked at CSR, as I said. He became the first president and founder of the Society of Industrial Editors, a national body that had 150 members. It was apart from all these IFAJ, ACAJ roles and whatever. He went to the war, and following the war he wrote the history of the 42nd Battalion, which he'd been attached to. He retired from CSR and became a lecturer at the Sydney Technical College. He was quite prolific. Don Jones was one of the original committee. In 1966, he became the treasurer within the first few months. He left the committee in 1973 when he was transferred to Melbourne by his then employer, the Australian Wool Board, but returned to Sydney, and he returned to the committee in 1980. He was elected president in 1996 and served 2 terms before retiring from Farm Writers in 1999. Don continues to assist with the judging annually of all the entries for the Writing Prize, including the Star Prize, for which we are all extremely grateful. Doug Denham was a journalist working in the Sydney Morning Herald, then Country Life, before becoming the public relations manager at the Royal Agricultural Society, which in those days was out at Moore Park. He retired from the committee in 1980 and was made a life member, and unfortunately died in 2014. Trevor Brown was a long-term serving member of Farm Writers, a long-term president in the 1980s. And then you remember the ABC's Country Hour. He was the voice of the Country Hour for 10 or more years. Sandy Grieve. Sandy joined Farm Writers in 1974, and he went on to become one of its most passionate supporters. He joined the committee sometime in the 80s and became president, succeeding Trevor Brown. Made a life member in 2001. He was, in the 1990s, he was the organising chairman of the 2000 IFAJ Congress, and was part of the massive amount of work that took to organise that. Colin Alexander Peden Munro, he would prefer, he liked that full title, I'm sure, if anybody remembers him. He served many years as vice president and committee member, but was never president. He was the president of ACAJ for many years. He was a long-time presenter and executive on ABC Radio, and a passionate supporter of the Stockman's Hall of Fame, the Royal Flying Doctor Service, the Isolated Children's Parents Association, the Highland Cattle Society. He was awarded an Award of Australia Medal in 2007, and unfortunately he died for short illness in 2010. Noreen Coulton, most of you would remember Noreen Coulton. She joined Farmrise in '76 when she was a PR assistant to Doug Denham. She joined the committee shortly after that. She retired. She spent 25 years on the committee, including 3 years as president in 1998 when she was first elected, and was the first female to have that honour. What's changed? Not a lot, as I've tried to point out. The early years was an amount of formal correspondence written between committee members, internally and externally, all formally typed and signed. Newsletters were Romeo. How many people remember Romeo machines? A few over here, but not many others. They were 7 to 9 pages in length, and some of them had a hatches, matches and dispatches section which dealt with various committee members getting married or having children or whatever. Initially only journalists could serve, with PR people, as I said, filling other roles. Until at least the mid-1990s, seminar bookings were done by telephone, and some designated then person at the end of that phone had to actually fill out a form or write all those people's names down and their phone numbers and make a list, typed or handwritten, of the attendees of the function of the month. Faxes were introduced in the 1990s, and most inter-committee correspondence were faxed in those few years, with emails following a few years after that. I assume now there's a few texts go round the place. Farmrise launched its first website in 2000, emailed newsletters shortly afterwards, booking and payments by credit card were introduced in 2010. Thankfully, I was the treasurer at the time when we had $7,000 worth of debtors that I used to have to follow up before that. YouTube in 2012, and Twitter, whatever that is, in 2014. What next? I hear you say. There's a little plot of history of the place. Thank you, Ben.